Attention! By decree of the Lord of Holy Terror and by extension the God Emperor of Mankind, queries into the recorded archives you are requesting are strictly prohibited. By querying such information of a prohibited nature is tantamount to heresy. As an act to such, it is an account the God Emperor's decree and edict. You are thusly a heretic. As a convicted heretic, you're in violation of the following. Article 1073P, DAC 977864/211/.
So no shit, there we were, delivering the live Xanthrope we'd hauled halfway across the galaxy. Instead of thanking us for our hard work and offering to buy us all a beer, the Inquisitor running the facility placed us under arrest. There ain't no fucking justice. We all just stood there, paralyzed, at the news that our boss, Inquisitor Oak, had been branded a rogue, a traitor to the Inquisition. The mere fact that we were his subordinates damned us in the eyes of the Inquisition, and to make matters even worse, we were apparently on the hook for just about everything we'd done since we started our mission, as well as a few other things we hadn't. Not that it really mattered what we had or hadn't done, since the motto of the Inquisition courts is, quote, "A plea of innocence is guilty of wasting our time." So it slowly dawned on each of us that, unless something amazingly unexpected happened, our future would consist of a quick trial and execution. If we were lucky, that is. If we were unlucky, it'd be a long trial and a longer execution. Perhaps inevitably, Nubby was the first one to come to grips with the situation, and before the Inquisitor had even finished telling his 2 Death Watch Space Marine bodyguards to kill us if we attempted to do anything, the little trooper was volunteering to testify against Oak in exchange for clemency, and also possibly a small cash payment. The Inquisitor responded to this outburst by briefly turning his unnervingly steady gaze to the cretinous little trooper, who suddenly forgot how to speak mid-sellout. After a few vague uhing sounds, Nubby sat down, gripping his head with one hand and making rude gestures at the Inquisitor with the other. The Inquisitor dropped Nubby from his attention and finished the Marine's orders with an apology for the indignity of the assignment and promised to call an extra team down to properly arrest us when his ship returned in a few hours. Then, as almost an afterthought, he warned them that the little one is a psyker and will need to be put into one of the cells. Both the Marines turned their bolters on Nubby and began advancing. There were a bit of confusion as Nubby, who was still incapable of speaking, attempted to hide behind the rest of us. Sarge, seeing an opportunity, grabbed the undersized trooper by his collar and proffered him to the advancing Marines while Amy and Doc moved in front of Bumbles. Unfortunately, this brilliant plan was spoiled by the fact that the Inquisitor wasn't a gullible idiot. When the Marines returned with Nubby suspended by one augmented leg, the Inquisitor let out a sigh of annoyance, which was the most emotion we'd seen from him yet, and told the Marines to stop embarrassing themselves and collect the one with the psyker coat. When the Marines returned with Doc, who had hurriedly put on Fumble's coat, the Inquisitor let out another sigh and made a gesture. There was a little yelp from the back of our group as an invisible force yanked Fumbles into the air and began levitating him across the landing pad. Without another word from us or the Death Watch Marines, the Inquisitor followed our whimpering psyker into the large elevator where his non-superhuman flunkies were waiting with the demon thrope. The elevator doors slid shut behind Bumbles and the Inquisitor with an ominous boom, leaving our landing party alone on the pad with the 2 Death Watch Marines. After a few seconds of awkward silence, Amy pointed out that the Inquisitor was a colossal asshole. One of the Marines responded with a vaguely agreeable grunt, earning him an angry look from his partner. By the by, all looks are angry and power armor. The pisser of the two Marines tossed Doc in our general direction, and then both of them trained their weapons on our little group and settled into a comfortable guard stance. All around the pad, the AA guns that defended the facility came to life and turned to rest on our shuttle as well. We may have not been cuffed, placed in a cell, or even properly disarmed yet, but all in all, it was very clear that we weren't going anywhere. Unless someone did something suicidally stupid, that is. Hopefully, it wouldn't have to be us. So, to summarize our situation, we were sweating through our fancy but completely unarmored uniforms on a landing pad while two boltered armed Deathwatch Space Marines kept us covered and watched our every movement like genetically engineered superhawks. Since Bumbles was off enjoying the hospitality of the creepy monotone Inquisitor, our landing party consisted of all of us Guardsmen, the 3 adepts, and a very unhappy Jim. Armament-wise, none of us except Twitch and Nubby, who had a few party favors crammed into their pockets, were armed with no more than our last pistols. We hadn't just left our pulse weapons behind, mind you. We'd just decided to leave them in the shuttle, where their techno-heretical nature wouldn't cause any problems if the Inquisitor running the facility had a rod up his ass. In retrospect, we might have underestimated the size of hypothetical rod. Our weapon-filled shuttle was parked a dozen meters away from where the Space Marines had corralled us. Aside from our cache of weapons, it was equipped with a multi-laser turret which only Jim knew how to actually use. Enough armor to hold off bolter fire if the Marines made sure to miss the half-ass patch of Bright Lance holes, and maybe enough fuel to get us back into orbit. Oh, and it had Sergeant Gravis' stasis unit, but we didn't really see that as tactically significant. The facility we were on top of was your standard secret mountain base affair. You know, a landing pad, a bit of a rooftop sticking out of a dangerously steep mountainside with Emperor knows how much hidden stuff underground. It was only really distinguishing features, as far as we were concerned with, were the local climate, which was blistering hot despite the altitude, and the massive ring of anti-air turrets surrounding the landing pad. We weren't quite sure who was controlling said turrets, or what their reaction time was like, but none of us felt like doing any experiments to figure that out. After our feeble plan to hold on to Bumbles had fallen apart, we'd spent a few minutes stewing in our own juices on the landing pad. The true shittiness of the situation began to really sink in. Amy started cursing under her breath and steadily increased the volume until she was ranting like a street corner preacher. Nubby propped his oversized coat up as a sunshade. No poles were used. The thing was actually filthy enough to stand up on its own, and that was after it had been washed. And grumpily sat underneath it, waiting for his voice to return and egging Amy on as best he could with grunts and gestures. Sarge just stood stock still, muttering darkly to himself and ignoring everyone else. Even when Doc tried to ask him for help subduing Twitch, who'd started pacing in circles and ranting about he knew all along and they were all in on it. Really, Tink and Doc were the only ones who took it best. After the initial freakout, the medic took refuge in the familiar, if difficult, task of tranquilizing Twitch before he did anything explodey. Tink spent a few minutes smugly pointing out that, while he had been arrested by the Inquisition, it hadn't been for tech heresy, and therefore everyone owed him an apology. He eventually realized no one was listening and decided to sit down and play with his drone controller instead. There was a tense moment as he drew the controller out from his tack belt, but the Marines eventually accepted Tink's blatant lie about it just being a data slate and didn't shoot him. As for the rest of the party, Jim sank down into a little puddle of misery, chattering to himself in binary and rocking back and forth, and the adepts all gathered into a little huddle. After a few minutes of serious discussion, the old diplomat adept turned to the rest of us, cleared his throat until We grudgingly paid attention, and asked us whether we thought Oak had actually turned traitor. He seemed surprised at how little we cared. I mean, it's not like we thought the question of whether or not our boss was a heretical mastermind that had been trying to destroy the Inquisition from within wasn't important. We just didn't see how it was relevant to our current situation. Either A. Oak is a heretic, in which case the Inquisition would imprison, torture, and slowly kill us. B. Oak wasn't a heretic, but someone had framed him as one, in which case the Inquisition would probably imprison, torture, and slowly kill us, though they might apologize to Oak about it afterwards if everything was sorted out. Or C. Oak wasn't a heretic, and the monotone Inquisitor was lying about the Inquisition ordering his arrest as part of some sort of conspiracy, in which case a bunch of political backstabbers or shadowy cabal of heretics would imprison, torture, and slowly kill us. I'm sure you can see the common theme here. As far as we were concerned, the question of our Inquisitor's moral status was academic, and was therefore something that could be left to the academics while we focused on more important issues. Specifically, how we were going to avoid being imprisoned, tortured, and slowly killed. The old diplomat got a little huffy with us and said very hurtful things about our attention spans and our intellectual capabilities as compared to those of a bunch of drunken orcs. Eventually, though, he calmed down and announced his and the other adepts' certainty that Oak was innocent. Sarge, who was just in about the worst mood any of us had ever seen him, responded with a bit of sarcasm, to which the diplomat returned with interest. The situation had all the markings of a really good argument, and lacking anything better to do, we all gathered around to watch the fireworks. But then Tink spoiled everything by asking whether we should tell the Inquisitor everything about the Xanthrop before he finished taking it out of the stasis unit. Well, you better believe that got everyone's attention, including the two Death Watch Marines, who could apparently hear everything we were saying. The less pissy of the two Marines, whose only distinguishing features was a yellow-edged pauldron with a cartoon heart on it, took a few steps towards us. This paused when he realized his companion wasn't moving. The other Space Marine, who sported some sort of pointy black cross on a white background, just shook his head. And the Heart Marine sheepishly shuffled back to his guard position as we all huddled around Tink's drone controller. Spot the Wonder drone had been incorporated into the Demon Throat's containment unit when we made the thing mobile, partially because the drone was as good a central controller for the various systems as anything else we had on hand, but mostly because few really wanted to keep the hunk of Wraithbone, which suppressed the lion's share of the Demon Throp's power. The Wraithbone suppressor had been positioned on the very top of the Demon Throp's pallet, with all its cables and stuff hanging down over the outside of the stasis unit, where they conveniently hid the Demon Throp's smoking wings from anyone who didn't know to look for them. Spot had been encased in an oversized service skull disguised and placed on top of the suppressor, where the drone could easily lift the whole thing off and bring it back to us after the Inquisition had set up whatever they used to contain uppity demon hosts. Anyways, thanks to all this, we had a clear readout telling us that the Demon Throp's pallet was about 100 meters below us, and its containment measures were being deactivated by someone who probably didn't know that it held something just a little bit nastier than your average Xanthrop. The question was whether we should try to warn them, let them figure things out for themselves, or maybe help things along a little bit by pushing the big red button on Tink's drone controller. The debate over what to do with the Demon Throat was a very awkward one. I mean, you can't just say stuff like, I think we should use the device right here to unleash the demon host we brought with us and then escape in the resulting confusion in front of a pair of Death Watch Space Marines. That'd be rude. Also, they'd shoot us. So we had to be careful not to say anything about the demon or spot or escaping or anything remotely related to what was going on really. Now, if we'd been proper inquisitional agents, we'd use witty metaphors and ironic code words, possibly leaving the Marines with the impression that we're merely planning a fancy dress party or something. Unfortunately, we're just a bunch of guardsmen, and had to make do with grunts, shrugs, expletives, and a wide array of rude gestures. Judging by the look on Jim and the Abbot's face, we wound up looking like a bunch of ogrins trying to argue philosophy. But it honestly worked pretty well. Who knows what the Marines thought? Maybe they thought that we were suffering strokes or something. Anyways, skipping over a whole lot of nigh incomprehensible arguing, we eventually decided that the odds of us surviving the demon throat breaking loose were even worse than if we got into an inquisitional trial. Unless, that is, the bug only broke partway out and they pinned smuggling a demon host into an inquisitional facility on us, along with everything else. Put together, it was enough to convince Sarge that our best option was to fess up to the demon trope's true nature and hope that we got bonus points for saving whichever idiot was in the process of releasing it. That decided, Sarge stood up, walked towards the Marines until they ordered him to stop or be shot full of holes, told them the Xanthrope we delivered had been possessed by a demon, and asked them to warn the Inquisitor not to mess with its containment. Heart Marine called him a liar, and Grumpy Marine called him a heretic. Sarge made 3 more attempts to convince the Death Watch Marines, but the closest he got to success was briefly arguing with the Heart Marine over whether or not Tyrannid could be possessed by a demon. That ended with the Marine calling Sarge an idiot for trying to lie about Tyrannid biology to someone who'd fought them for 3 decades, and Sarge gave up the argument in disgust. After that failure, and operating on pure desperation at this point, our fearless leader decided to see if just offering raw facts to the Marines would work. He called Tank over to show the readouts of the Demon Thrope's palette. This resulted in the Marines calling the Inquisitor to tell him that we had some sort of remote connection to the palette and spot signal being jammed. The whole time this was going on, the diplomacy adept just stood there, shaking his head and running an increasingly bitter play-by-play critique under his breath. When it finally ended with Sarge and Tank both vowing to just stand there and laugh while the demonic bugs killed the Marines, the old diplomat walked out to Sarge and congratulated him on learning absolutely nothing during the months of diplomatic tutoring sessions. Sarge suggested that the adept go talk to the Free Marines himself if he was so smart, and got told he should have thought of that before cramming his foot so far into his mouth that he'd start shitting toes. After the shocked pause that remark triggered, Doc asked if he could have a turn. Both Sarge and the diplomacy adept told him they didn't care anymore. So, while Sarge and the old diplomat glared at each other, and the rest of us began laying plans to take advantage of the inevitable demon-thropic escape, Doc walked right over to the 2 Deathwatch Marines and tried to convince them that we totally weren't heretics. Between the fact that Doc was just about the opposite of a confident, persuasive speaker, and the Deathwatch Marines being a pair of 3-meter tall killing machines with glowing red eyes and a permanent expression of angry disapproval, the whole thing was rather comically pathetic. Our medic stammered and nervously giggled his way through an explanation of how we had no idea what was going on with our Inquisitor, or what sort of experiments were going on at this facility. We'd just been following what had been, at the time, been perfectly legitimate Inquisitional orders like a bunch of good little guardsmen, and then our astropath had exploded. And every time we tried to get a new one, people attacked us, and we really had no other options aside from following our original orders, and so on. The whole time, both the Marines just stared at him, as if eyeing a small, fiercely yapping dog and debating whether to laugh at it or punt it over the horizon. Doc finally began to run out of steam when he got to the part with the space station, because there's just no denying that we shot, exploded, and melted a bunch of loyal Imperial subjects, which is something that's sort of hard to wave off as just an accident, even if it totally was. Also, there was just no way to explain the whole thing with the warp fungus without sounding like either a liar or a madman. He stuttered to a stop, stared at the two impassive space marines for a few seconds, and then burst into a sudden confidence, announced that at least we definitely hadn't murdered any space marines. In fact, except for the ones that got skewered by the high tyrant, all of them were still alive, and he could prove it since Sergeant Gravis was currently in our shuttle. Upon hearing Doc's statement, Heart Marine rocked forward a step, paused for a second to have an inaudible argument with his partner, and then finally told the medic to show him Gravis. A minute later, they came back out, collected the still freaking out Jim, and then wheeled Gravis' stasis unit out into the landing pad. As the two Death Watch Marines huddled over the stasis chamber and inspected what was left of its occupant, we felt a sudden surge of hope that we could convince them to at least keep the Inquisitor from releasing the demon thrope. The grumpy Marine spun around, shoved his bolter into Doc's face, and asked why Gravis was imprisoned in a stasis field and what sort of heretical experiments had been planned for him in this facility. Doc didn't wet himself in terror, but it was a near thing. Not being a good bullshitter, our medic-turned-diplomat fell back on the only thing he was certain of: the precise details of Gravis' injuries and subsequent treatments. The two Death Watch Marines seemed rather taken aback by the sudden tide of completely incomprehensible medical jargon, and after a few more seconds of glowering, they stepped back into their impassive guard positions. Doc, having no idea whether this meant they were listening or not, kept on babbling while the rest of us watched and grew more and more antsy. Luckily, before any of us ran out of patience and did something to screw everything up, the third Death Watch Marine arrived. This Marine was a little different from the other two. In addition to the colorful shoulder badge, blue with a comment on it, his black armor was decorated with white bits and was carrying what even the most uneducated guardsman could recognize as an apothecary tools. He came out of the base elevator at a dead sprint, skidded to a stop in front of Gravis' stasis unit, and began bellowing questions at Doc. As Doc finished his explanation for the second time, the apothecary turned to the other two Marines, and the three of them began arguing. They were using their helmet comms, so we couldn't hear a word, of course, but it was obvious it was a very heated argument, and since we had a lot on the line and were bored, we decided to see if we couldn't listen in. Approximately half a second after Tink managed to get his drone controller turned to their comm frequency and had started working at cracking it, all three Marines turned to face us and Jim sprinted over. The tech priest yanked Tink's controller away and suggested that if we wanted to die, shooting ourselves would be a far more pleasant way to go than to get caught in a half-assed attempt at etheric warfare. Tink eventually got his controller back, but only because Sarge promised not to let him use it anymore. Anyways, the Space Marines resumed their argument after that little hiccup, and after another few minutes of agonizing wait, seriously, it'd been like 20 minutes since we received the warning about the Demon Throat's containment being disabled, they apparently reached a decision. The apothecary announced his intention to temporarily revive Gravis and obtain testimony from him. Doc asked how this was possible, and Gravis' lungs being, rather non-functional, cut in half, in addition to the whole being comatose thing. He was told to stop asking questions and be ready to assist as needed. Doc had a few seconds to swell with pride at the thought of assisting an actual apothecary in treatment, and was then nearly crushed by the Space Marine beginning unloading 100 kilos of oversized medical equipment onto him. Everything was laid out. Doc was sprayed with a Stardust grade disinfectant, which didn't quite cause him to run screaming in unbearable pain, and the stasis unit was deactivated. The first part of Gravis' revival went about as expected, as a medical operation being carried out by a centuries-old superhuman to go. Afterwards, Doc spent something like a month talking about how great a surgeon the apothecary was, how amazing all of the little medical toys he was using were, and what an honor it had been to be allowed to observe and assist in the operation. Even if all he had been allowed to do was hold a few things, one of which was a very nearly dropped, and dispose of a few vials of biotoxin, which, lacking a biohazard disposal bin, he just threw off the landing pad. Anyways, in a startling short amount of time, Gravis had been injected, implanted, drained, and a dozen other medical things, and then the apothecary deftly popped the torsified Space Marine out of the power armor, which had kept him alive for so long. I can't really say what we expected the next step of the process to be. Perhaps something involving some sort of super-powered stimulants, and blink twice for yes, or something. In any case, we certainly hadn't expected the apothecary to pull out a length of cable, jack one into his helmet, and the other into one of those weird black sockets on Gravis' spine. After that, there was a very anticlimactic 2 or 3 minutes of watching the apothecary and Gravis do nothing. And then the cable was detached. Doc was told to clean up and re-engage the stasis field, and the apothecary went back to arguing with the other 2 Death Watch Marines. Once again, we stood around like a bunch of piss ants, watching a conversation we couldn't hear. But at least it was more interesting to watch this time. If their last argument was heated, then this one was practically molten. The Marines were actually yelling loud enough for us to hear the occasional word through their helmets. There was a lot of gesturing going on, and the Heart Marines seemed especially furious about something we really hoped wasn't us. When the Marines' argument finally ended with Heart Marine storming off towards the base elevator and the apothecary returning to pick up his medical gear, Doc decided to see if he was allowed to ask questions now. It turned out that either the apothecary was far friendlier Space Marine than any of us ever met, or perhaps Gravis had said something on Doc's behalf. Either way, we were finally given a rundown of the situation. Sergeant Gravis had testified. No, we were not told how collecting said testimony had worked, because the mysteries of the Black Carapace were not for us to know. No, not even if it turned out that we were completely innocent. What part of not for us to know didn't we understand? No, the secret wasn't that all Space Marines were actually psychic, and our questions privileges would be revoked if we did not ask about something else. Gravis had said that we were a bunch of dangerous incompetents, but probably not heretics, and had backed us up in regards to the dangerousness of the demonthrope, if not the demon-ness. The Inquisitor had been informed of this, but had been dubious about the reliability of Gravis' testimony. After a bit of debate, the Inquisitor and the Marines decided that the demonthrope would be immediately destroyed. Heart Marine was going down to observe the procedure, purely for reasons of protocol, of course. The news that they were just going to kill the literally damned bug after we spent all that time and effort hauling it across the ass end of the Imperium did not go over well. I mean, we probably should have been happy since it was supposed to be used as evidence in our crimes or something, but still. Anyways, Sarge made a spirited attempt to convince the Marines that the demonthrope containment unit would work just fine as if it was left alone. He was told that the Xanthrope was an abomination in the eyes of the Emperor, and destruction was the only true safe option. Twitch, who was coming back into focus after being tranquilized, loudly agreed with this statement, and was told that he was not being very helpful. It then occurred to Tank that it would be very hard to kill the demonthrope without removing it from its containment unit. He asked the apothecary about this, and was told that the standard procedure was to shove the whole damn thing into a plasma incinerator. Tink asked what would happen to Spot. got asked who Spot was, and got as far as my drink before Amy and Nubby both grabbed him. The apothecary accepted Amy's explanation that, quote, he named the containment unit Spot. He's weird like that, without comment. It was at this point, as Tink was being dragged away from the Marines and quietly told that Field could build him a new damn drone if we got out of this alive, that a horribly familiar jittery scratching sensation went through all of our heads. Veteran bug wranglers that we were, we immediately recognized the psychic screech as a sign of a partial containment failure on the demon thrope. At least, we figured it was partial, on the account that there weren't bugs coming out of the walls and all. Sarge immediately informed the two confused space marines of the situation and abandoned all pretense of diplomacy and demanded to know what the hell their boss was playing at. While Sarge yelled unhelpfully at the Marines, Tink pulled out his drone controller and announced that he'd started getting a faint signal through the jamming again. From what he could see, all the regular size suppressors were offline, and the Wraith Bone one had been disabled. The stasis field was keeping the demon thrope in check. Feeling pretty sure that he knew what his orders would be if he'd asked for them, the techie immediately started mashing the button to re-engage the Wraith Bone suppressor. Through some sort of miracle, the signal made it through, and the psychic pressure of the demon thrope's mind began to diminish. For about 10 seconds, that is. Then Spot 2.0 reported a, quote, flagrant system error, and a second psychic screech knocked all non-superhumans on the pad to their knees. Over by the Marines, Sarge and Doc hauled themselves back to their feet and practically begged the Astartes to do something. The two Death Watch Marines ignored them and started arguing again. Since our guards were preoccupied, and it looked like this shit was about to hit the fan either way, the rest of us decided it would be a good time to go collect all the weapons we had left in the shuttle. Jim and the adepts were left standing in the middle of the landing pad, viewing the situation with increasing alarm, and were therefore in the best position to observe what happened next. A third screech doubled everyone over again, and was followed by the quote-unquote sound of Bumbles screaming for someone to come out and help him before, quote-unquote, they all go loose. Then the entire pad shook, and a geyser of fire and blackish-green lightning shot out of the factory roof. As we all pulled ourselves upright and followed the standard guard post-explosion procedure of asking everyone if they were dead, the Heart Marine punched his way through the elevator doors. He began walking towards us, and then turned around as a pair of lightning-wreathed figures rose out of the flaming crater behind him. The closer figure was a human-looking shape obscured by some sort of bluish energy bubble, judging by the hat and the coat it was wearing, plus the fact that the only other nearby psyker we knew was currently screaming for help somewhere down below us. It was probably the Inquisitor. There was nothing indistinct about the second figure. It was the demon thrope in all its horrible, unholy splendor. The 3-meter-tall, snake-like bug still has Sarge's whole metal shield wrapped around its head, but its eyes blazed red through the metal, and a pair of horns, as well as a far more demonic-looking maw, had somehow formed on the surface of the half-slag shield. The big change, though, was its wings. Inside of the stasis field, they had been some sort of vestigial-looking, but now they were stretched twice as wide as the demon thrope was tall. And they looked a lot more solid than we've ever seen before. Before this, and when they'd been sported by the possessed Narlock and the Cogitant, they'd been sort of indistinct and smoky. Now they were more like clouds of ink bound into tentacle-like tendrils. The green static cracked through and around them in the field of a poorly maintained power weapon. All in all, it was the most demonic-looking thing we've ever seen. And mind you, that list includes a fair few demons. As the two of them rose out of the crater in the facility's roof, the lightning arc between the demon thrope and the Inquisitor's shield steadily intensified. just as it occurred to us that we should probably do something to help. The Inquisitor's shield disappeared with a pop. The man hung there for a second, looking surprised, then let out a terrifying scream as the electricity reappeared all along his body. His back began to arch, then bend, then crackle. There was a final shrill scream and a horribly gooey, crunchy sound, and a basketball-sized sphere, slightly cooked gore and overly dramatic clothing splattered on the ground. Jim and the two of the three adepts screamed. Amy snickered. Tink and Twitch simultaneously yelled, "Told you so!" to no one in particular. Sarge facepalm and Doc looked up at the apothecary. The medical marine let out a weary sigh as the Inquisitor's hat drifted down to rest on top of its compressed corpse, and muttered something about needing to get yet another new Inquisitor. Nubby, in his voice returning, pointed out, "The big demonic bug thing over and over there," which was entertaining itself by tearing a hole in the fabric of reality, and asked the Marines what they were going to do about it. Grumpy and Heart Marine both let out a battle cry and charged forward. The apothecary shook his head and followed them at a more sedated pace. With a little mutter about having fun with that, Nubby started sidling towards the shuttle, only to be yanked into the air by Sarge, who was already bellowing orders and demanding for information at the rest of us. Jim reported that the shuttle was still out of fuel, still had 20 AA guns pointed at it, and still had its long-range comms jammed. Tink checked his controller and said that the drone was coming back online, and the Wraithbone suppressor might be salvageable if he went down to fiddle with it. Sarge digested this, and then declared that since running away and calling for reinforcement weren't viable options, our only real choice was to kill the bug. The problem with this idea was that none of us had any desire to go toe-to-toe with something that could compress someone into a paste with a glance. Luckily, there were 3 crazy bastards in power armor who would do that for us. All we needed to do was figure out a way to help the Marines without getting ourselves horribly killed in the process. A short debate was held, and by the time the Death Watch Marines had opened fire, a plan had been formed. It was decided that Sarge and Amy would stay on the surface. They'd do their best to assist the Marines, probably by picking up the small tide of demonoids that started pouring out of the newly opened warp rift, and try to avoid drawing too much of the Demon Throat's attention. Meanwhile, Tink would go and retrieve this drone with the Wraithbone suppressor, and then try to figure out a way to weaponize it, while Nubby would do the same thing with Bumbles. Twitch would support them and lend them his skill in the whole weaponizing thing, and Doc would go along and make sure that nobody did anything retarded, which technically made him the man in charge. Doc was not thrilled about his assignment. Finally, Jim and the Adams were told to go do something useful, like getting the AA guns sorted out, or unjamming the long-range comms, or finding some sort of holy artifact stored in a case marked, "In case of demonic incursion, break glass." Anything that got them out of the line of fire, really. They accepted their orders without complaint and scampered off after Doc's team towards the partially destroyed elevator on the base. Those of us on Team Doc climbed through the hole in the Heart Marine had punched through the elevator doors. Inside, we discovered the reason for the Marine's violent exit. The elevator car appeared to be stuck halfway down the shaft, and all the lights and control panels were dark. There was a maintenance ladder on the far side of the shaft, which, judging by the massive hands and foot-shaped dents in the rungs, the Marine had used to get back up to the surface. We noticed that a few of the rungs had either been broken or ripped entirely out of the wall, but the Space Marine weighed a lot more than us, so we figured it was probably safe to begin climbing down. Jib and the Adams were a little bit more dubious. They eventually gave up looking for other options and followed us. After Twitch popped a rung loose, which barely missed Doc, and dropped half down a level, they decided that whatever they were going to do could probably be done on the first level, and hastily exited the shaft. We asked them to look into fixing the elevator while they were at it. The signal from Spot and the volume of Bumbles' periodic, incoherent psychic shouts peaked 3 levels below the struck elevator, and we decided to exit the shaft. Tink suffered a minor heart attack when the first thing he saw after prying open the doors was a pair of turrets aimed at his nose. Luckily, they didn't seem to register him as a threat, or the rest of us managed to catch the techie as he reflectively dodged backwards into the shaft. After a little debate over whether the turrets were just waiting for us to let our guard down, which ended with Nubby tossing a half-eaten ration bar at them to see if they would return fire, we eventually climbed through the doors. We found ourselves in a short hallway that ended at the second pair of turrets and an impressive-looking security door. Another debate was started over whether the turrets would attack us if we tried to plasma the door open, but Doc resolved the issue by checking the door's controls and discovered that it wasn't actually locked. In fact, none of the doors we ran into on our way into the base were locked, and all the turrets were just as immobile as the AA guns on the surface had been, which had both been convenient and disconcerting as hell. I mean, we just delivered a demonically possessed Xanthrop to the place. Who knew what sort of shit was pinned up down there just waiting for a chance to escape? Well, actually, the recently squished Inquisitor, probably known, since judging by the ransacked appearance of the facility, he'd been spending the last week or so gathering up every piece of evidence of heretical experiments or whatever. He was also a bit too busy being an asshole, also dead, to share that information with us, though. Anyways, none of us, not even Twitch, had time to spare worrying about what was in the base or why security was offline, because we could hear and feel the battle going back up on the pad. We followed Spot's signal, rushed through the hallways and across a recently stripped down room without any incident, until we finally reached the security door with a piece of paper that said evidence storage taped to it. We opened the door, which led to yet another turd-filled hallway, at the exact same instance as some sort of 8-legged, augmented, covered lizard monster came through the far door. We looked at the lizard monster. It probably looked at us. Something in the room behind it exploded, and Nubby slammed the door back shut. A bare second after the door slid closed, something slammed into it, leaving a large outward dent in the metal. This was followed by the sound of 4 turrets beeping to life and a sort of general fracas as they and the lizard monster sorted out their differences. Nubby and his finger still held firm on the closed button suggested finding another way into the evidence room, or at least waiting to see if the turrets won. Doc, feeling he should do something leaderly, announced that there probably wasn't enough time, so they'd have to open the door and deal with the thing. The rest of us agreed, but the question of just how to do it was up for debate. After a short argument in which it was decided that trying to flash and rush a creature that had a metal plate instead of eyes and could punch a head-sized dent into security doors was stupid, we decided to go with our other usual strategy of blowing the ugly thing up. There was a problem with this plan, though. It had been several weeks of combat since our last resupply, and Twitch's stockpile of explosives were down to just a backup grenade and frag mine, plus the single improvised explosive which Sarge had let him bring into the shuttle. Twitch asked the rest of us to pony up whatever we had, but Tink and Doc didn't have anything except for a few flashes. Doc was given shit for not saving the syringe of face-melting biotoxins that had been recently extracted from Gravis, at least until he threatened to go get another one and let Tink carry it. Nubby, on the other hand, grinned an evil little grin when he was asked, and reached into his perpetually filthy coat. Up on the surface, Brother Bellicus of the Black Templars noticed a large group of demonic hummergrants moving to flank him, reached for his grenades, and swore when his hand closed on nothing. At Twitch's mark, Nubby popped open the door just wide enough for a lumpy object which consisted of a half-dozen cross-wired lasgun power packs wrapped with tape and nails and 2 Astarte-sized frag grenades to be tossed through. A few seconds later, the door was reopened as far as the dent would allow, and we all squeezed into a hallway which was a bit worse for wear and smelled rather disturbingly like grilled groks. We all resisted the urge to see if the xenos remains tasted like what it smelled, made our way to the far end of the hallway, and discovered that the door had locked itself when the turrets had been activated. Since said turrets had been pounded into scrap by the lizard thing, Tank just plasma the door locking mechanism and opened to reveal a scene of pure mayhem. To start with, it wasn't an evidence room, it was an evidence warehouse. The place was absolutely massive and filled with stacks upon stacks of eye-stamped boxes, as well as a few hundred large metal cubes that we guessed were some sort of mobile prison cell. The stacks had probably been all in a neat and orderly up to a few minutes ago, but the explosion that had preceded the demon's escape had occurred just on the other side of the room's left wall. The crates and cells had been scattered across the room, many cracked open in the process. Servitors, terrified scribes, prisoners, and escaped xeno specimens were running in every direction. Several things had caught fire, and the center of the room was the mother of all three-way melees. As far as we could tell, the teams were the remnants of ex-Inquisitor's retinue, a group of servitors and prisoners led by something that looked like a human except with the size of an orc war boss, and what we guessed, based on the extra limbs and such, was an entire gene stealer cult. Nubby tried to close the door again, but was stopped by Doc. We all stared at the carnage for a while, and then unanimously decided that we wanted nothing to do with any of it. Don't get me wrong, we're all brave, upstanding soldiers of the Astra Militarum, the many, the expendable, the Guard, and all of that, but we had more pressing things to deal with, and honestly, we just didn't care who was fighting who over what. In our professional opinion, they all looked like psychotic assholes, so we were perfectly fine with them killing each other until their hearts were content, at least as long as they didn't drag us into it. We began sighting around the edge of the room towards the Demon Throat's crater, the sighting being a form of movement which best conveys, "I'm not a part of this, please ignore me and go about your business argument murder." It took a little work to find our way through the scattered evidence boxes while simultaneously trying to keep as much cover as possible between us and the melee. But aside from the occasional stray shot whizzing by or still warm corpse laying in our path, we managed to avoid most of the locals. There were only 3 real interruptions in our progress. The first was when a terrified man we recognized as the scribe that had accompanied the Inquisitor on the landing pad nearly ran into us. Twitch shot the man in reflex, and the rest of us refrained from commenting. The second interruption was a little more eventful. A giant man thing in the middle of the room bellowed, a cell crashed into a wall ahead of us, and something tentacular began to worm its way out. Twitch shot this interruption on reflex too, but this time the rest of us joined in. After a few volleys, the tentacles retreated back into the cell, which Twitch tossed in his frag grenade in after them, and we continued on our way. And the last interruption occurred when we neared the crater entrance and did not begin with Twitch shooting anyone, but that was only because Nubby grabbed his gun. As we approached the edge of the crater, 3 indistinct forms that looked a bit like short cloaked figures came around a pile of crates and practically walked into us. Nubby stopped Twitch and gestured at the rest of us squeeze against the walls. We did as he said, and watched in surprise as he cheerfully waved at the 3 figures, then directed them towards the exit. There was a greasy croaking sound, a whiff of something absolutely vile, and then the figures just vanished into thin air. That was a little disconcerting, but Nubby told the rest of us that it was fine. The cloaked whatsits were bendies, and that they were wonderful people, for horrible mutant xenos at least. Apparently they hung out in the sewers of some hive worlds, and were just a great way of getting rid of things. You know, like prescribed substances that no one would buy, or pieces of equipment that you just happen to have lying around on the battlefield, but turned out to belong to the commissar and now had your fingerprints all over them. Or bodies. Great for getting rid of bodies. Anyways, the wonderful people, he said, aside from the smell, and the rest of us just eyed Nubby, who had never intentionally bathed or changed his underwear in his life, and whose breath could tarnish ceramite, and just decided not to comment. Shortly after the slightly disturbing encounter, we reached the gaping hole and had been blasted into the room's wall. The room on the other side was a much smaller version of the evidence room, with a brand new Demonthrope installed skylight. We guessed that it had held 50 or so evidence boxes, one of those mobile cells, 8-ish inquisitorial minions. Now it was just filled with parts. Anyways, the knee-deep gore was just backdrop. What really caught our eye when we peered through the crater was the only intact thing in the room, the top half of our Demonthrope containment unit. Oh, and the half-naked woman who crouched on top of it singing. After an initial second shock, the scantily clad woman just being about the last thing we'd expect to find in an Inquisitional resource facility, we realized that things were not as they seemed. It's hard to say what tipped us off exactly. It might have been the odd shape of her ears, or the unnatural harmonics of her singing, or maybe it was the words Eldar Subject Number 4 printed on the back of her tattered straitjacket. Regardless, our well-honed Inquisitional investigative abilities told us that while the creature prying at the containment unit was female, she was not a woman. She was also not an orc, no matter what Twitch said. So no shit, there we were, standing in the middle of the only entrance of a room containing a half-naked, unarmed Eldar of a female persuasion who was apparently too focused on singing to the Demonthrope containment unit to even notice our arrival. The question was, what to do with this sort of situation is something that bored guardsmen or idle cogitator adepts might spend endless amount of time arguing over. Not us, though. We were above that sort of thing. Yeah, okay, no we weren't. I mean, aside from avoiding work and blowing things up, pointless argument, especially sordid ones, were just about our favorite pastime. It was just that before we could get started, Tink noticed that a tendril of Wraithbone was snaking out towards the singing Eldar from the containment unit. Before any of us could stop him, the techie stepped around the corner, raised his plasma gun, and told the xenos to stop messing with his stuff and get his own damn Wraithbone. Nubby snickered, Doc groaned in exasperation, and Twitch pulled Tink out of the way of a bolt of lightning the Eldar flung at him. We all reflectively ducked into cover as 2 more lightning bolts shot through the hole. And when we peeked around the corner again, the entire back half of the small room was filled with an opaque mist. The next minute or so was spent calling Tink names. This was not the most productive use of our time, but none of us were dumb enough to try running into the mist and dislodging the xenopsyker. Doc was especially missed since his whole job had been to stop the rest of us from doing something like this. And Tink kept using that same excuse of why it wasn't his fault. Anyways, after another minute or so of juvenile arguing, it became apparent that the Eldar's mist wasn't going to just dissipate on its own, and something proactive needed to be done. Unfortunately, our options were sort of limited. Tink proposed a flashing clear, but the rest of us had bad memories the last time we tried that on a prepared psyker, and made that plan B. Nubby spoke up next and suggested going to get Bumbles, who was still making noises somewhere at the back of the evidence warehouse. Since this would involve either splitting up or leaving the Eldar to mess with the containment unit, and because we weren't too optimistic with Bumbles' ability to go head-to-head with the Eldar Psyker, this was made Plan C. Twitch began to suggest something truly harebrained, but was cut off by Doc, who decided that he had enough, and it was time to, quote, take charge of the situation. In an odd repeat of the last time we'd faced this sort of thing, Doc poked his head around the corner and attempted to engage the xenos in diplomacy. To our immense surprise, instead of shooting our medic in the head with a lightning bolt, the Eldar stopped singing to listen to him. Now, Doc wasn't a good, smooth talker, but he did tend to radiate some sort of awkward earnestness, which can really count for something in this sort of situation. The rest of us just watched with all varying degrees of incredulousness as he started off with apologizing for Tink's behavior, and then began explaining the overall situation and how the containment unit figured into it. The Eldar only responded with more silence. But since that wasn't a lightning bolt, Doc took it as a good sign and moved a little further into the room as he continued talking. It was honestly the most impressive attempt at interspecies diplomacies we'd witnessed. I mean, sure, we've seen worlds shared between humans and the Tau, but the Slitters tend to be sort of wishy-washy, and there'd probably been a lot of highly trained diplomats involved in that. This was just one slightly naive soldier trying to convince a xenos, who probably had a massive grudge against the Inquisition, not to mention the racial affinity for dickishness, to give peace a chance. It was powerful, moving really, and we honestly believe that given enough time, it totally would have worked. The thing was, though, that while Doc was making his heartfelt plea, Tink was playing around with his drone controller and managed to get control of Spot's recon sensor as well as one of the mundane side suppressors. And we were sort of on a tight schedule with the Demonthrope doing Emperor knew what above us and Bumbles still needing rescue. And, better safe than sorry, right? The Eldar had a second to be very surprised when her cloud of mist fizzled into nothing, and then a barrage of plasma and pulse rounds knocked her off the containment unit. Doc was not happy, even though we pointed out that our shots had missed anything immediately fatal, so if he really wanted to, he could patch up the Xenos and give her the whole friendship speech again. With the last obstacle out of his way, Tink ran over to the containment unit to see if the Eldar had done anything to it and figure out if the fancy Wraithbone suppressor was still salvageable. While he got to work, Doc grumpily dragged the bleeding Xenos into a position where he could simultaneously treat her and keep an eye on the entrance. Nubby and Twitch loitered for a few seconds to see if there was anything needing to be done until an especially loud shout for help from Bumbles reminded them that they had something else better to do. Nubby and Twitch's trip around the edge of the big room was relatively uneventful. It seemed like everything that was capable of movement had either fled the room or ran off to join the big melee, which was now reaching some sort of climax. The two troopers ignored the massive clusterfuck, paused to let the occasional running gunfight go past, or dodge a falling stacks of boxes. The only real excitement was when a cargo servitor holding an obese man crashed across their path and began bashing its captive against one of the stacks like an unwanted cat. The fat man was probably a psyker because he was screaming for help, really, and went a bit non-Euclidean, and the floor started glowing faces. But that might have had more to do with the large box labeled extra heretical that he was being bashed against. By the way, the two troopers ignored the altercation and walked through the patch of warped reality with the ease of people who'd seen worse phenomena on trips to the ship's mess. Aside from those little inconveniences, finding Bumbles really wasn't that hard. It was just a matter of heading in the general direction of all the psychic shouting, and then homing in on those sense of bowel-loosening fears emanating from the little psyker. So before long, Twitch and Nubby reached the corner of the room where Bumbles was hiding and discovered what had him so worked up. Then they carefully stepped backwards into cover to observe the situation. The scene was it was a weird one. Bumbles, or some other scrawny little psyker that periodically flickered in and out of visibility, radiating fear, had been chased up a pile of boxes by a mob of small, little green figures that looked vaguely like Nubby. The Gretchens were taking turns climbing up the pile and then fleeing back down as Bumbles' aura of terror overwhelmed them. But that sort of behavior wasn't anything too unusual given the racial affinity of cowardice. It was their boss that was a little bit on the weird part. You know those really secured prisoner transport thingies? Like the ones with the straps holding someone to a gurney along with a face mask and maybe some padlocks? Yeah, dial that up to 11. Replace the gurney with a hand truck being pushed by 3 Gretchens standing on each other's shoulders, and then replace the prisoner with a raving orc weird boy surrounded by an aura of crackling green light. And when I say raving, I mean it. The weird boy could speak Gothic, seemed to be using his mouth to compensate for being unable to move anything else, and from the sounds of it was, even by orc standards, completely batshit insane. It was hard to keep track of everything he was saying, but in a minute or so Twitch and Nubby were listening, the primary theme seemed to be that he wanted Bumbles' head. Literally. You know, like attached to his shoulder with stitches and stuff. He even had a Gretchen with a surgical mask standing by. From what we could tell, his motivation was that something to do with two heads being better than one, and it being the secret to
the brainy Hume's power.
So yeah, totally nuts, and very frustrated with Fumbles, who kept doing rude things like refusing to come down and to be decapitated, or claiming that he was only a figment of the orc's imagination. Now, as amusing as it would have been to stand there and keep watching the orc arguing with Fumbles, it just wasn't in the cards. Shortly after Twitch and Nubby arrived, the weird boy ran out of patience and announced that Fumbles had
to the count of 4 to come down, or I'ma squig ya.
Up to this point, Twitch had just been muttering to himself about how he knew it all along, and Nubby had mostly been trying to figure out if the box he was hiding behind, marked probably not heretical, had anything tactically useful or viable inside of it. It didn't. But the new timeline kicked them into gear. Both troopers raised their weapons and got ready to shoot the weird boy as soon as he finished his counting and began drawing on the notoriously unstable powers. Over the next 20 seconds, the orcs, with the help of his Gretchen horde, managed to count up to 2, then skipped to 5. Got confused at 8, went back down to 6 for another try, and finally decided to skip ahead to 13. Nubby and Twitch lowered their weapons again. Since there was apparently enough time to do something more clever than just spray and pray, Twitch brought out the mechanical action mine that was his last remaining explosive. For his part, Nubby began waving at Bumbles while concentrating on the thought of turning Twitch invisible while he planted the mine on the still counting weird boy. Bumbles noticed the waving and caught on pretty quickly. The little psyker faded back into visibility and screwed his face into a concentration, and Twitch faded out. The demolition trooper moved fast, which is why he was only 5 meters from the weird boy when a violent burst of energy from the warp smashed into Bumbles' mind, sending him reeling. Twitch swore as the invisibility fizzled, hucked the mine towards the weird boy like a frisbee, and sprinted back towards Nubby as the little trooper opened fire on full auto. Several things happened at once. Twitch's mind bounced off the thick metal band restraining the weird boy's head, sailed off in a random direction, and was snatched out of the air by an over-enthusiastic Gretchen, and promptly exploded. The force of the blast knocked the weird boy's dolly over backwards, taking the orc out of Nubby's line of fire and crushing 3 of the Gretchens that had been pushing it around. Nubby adjusted his aim, but as he did so, the orc psyker bellowed something. Somewhere in the pack of Gretchens, one of them exploded in a shower of green sparks and a small cloud of arctic smoke. The rest surged forward with high-pitched wags, intercepting Nubby's fire and closing the gap surprisingly fast. Nubby held the trigger down until Twitch reached him. Then they both did some quick math. Decided that 30 and an enraged weird boy to 2 weren't in their favor, and cheesed it. Now, despite what it looked like, this was not a cowardly retreat. It was actually a carefully planned tactical maneuver to distract the enemy from the true objective. Or at least it turned out that way in any case. Veteran retreaters that they were, Twitch and Nubby easily outpaced the Xeno and broke contact long enough to come up with a plan and split up. Twitch stayed on the path he'd been following. He found a nice little fire position and started shooting Gretchens as they came around a handy corner, racking up 7 kills without any real trouble. Then the weird boy and the Gretchens pushing him shot around the corner, tilting on one wheel and bellowing,
"It's squigging time!"
as he came. There was a brief struggle of wills. At the end of Twitch's mind was a fairly certain that he was actually a hyper-carnivorous ball of teeth. Luckily, Twitch's body was harder to convince, and shook off the weird boy's attack with no more damage than a few lacerations and a pulled muscle or 2. The demolitions trooper blinked, realized how close of fate worse than death he'd just come, and decided it was time to get running again. The small orcish horde let out another wag and followed him. A few dozen meters away, Nubby sidled through a gap between two stacks of boxes and found himself back where the chase had started. A quick scan of the area revealed that a few Gretchen had stayed behind and were in the process of carrying the still stunned Fumbles down from his perch on the pile. Nubby, not being one to do hard work himself when others seemed willing to do it for him, pulled out an IO stick and casually waited for the Gretchen to finish before gunning them down. Then, his heroic rescue completed, the little trooper wandered over to Bumbles and checked the psyker's status by prodding him in the ribs a few times. When this elicited nothing more than a faint groan, Nubby, muttering to himself about always having to do everything, grabbed one of Bumbles' legs and began dragging the psyker back towards the demon throat crater. Meanwhile, Twitch was barely staying ahead of the weird boy, who started emitting some sort of brilliant crackling energy that boosted his speed and that of his minions. It really was something out of his paranoid trooper's nightmares. Gretchen kept popping out of the side alleys before he could turn into them, and every time he hit a straightaway, the weird boy's hand truck gained a little ground. The fear just lent Twitch even more speed, though. And anyways, he had a plan. Mind you, it lacked a large amount of explosives that would make it a good plan in his eyes, but it was still a plan. On the outskirts of the minor war occurring in the middle of the evidence warehouse, a group of Gene Stealer cultists finally finished off the inquisitional minions that had been keeping them from the cell that contained their master. They cluttered around the cell door and began hacking at it with their claws and weapons, but paused at the sound of approaching footsteps and turned to face the new threat. Twitch came around the corner at a dead sprint, saw the group of mutated cultists, sighted on an alley in the far right side of their group, closed his eyes, and triggered the underbarrel flash grenade launcher on his pulse carbine. He barreled into the stunned cultist, knocking two aside with his shoulders and nearly tripping over a third, and somehow managed to push his way through them to the alley he had targeted, where he slammed headfirst into a crate. Twitch reeled backwards, barely dodging the fallen crate marked Class 5 Forbidden Xenotech, and staggered into an alley before any of the cultists could follow. Behind him, there was the high-pitched wag, and the distinctive sound of warp-propelled hand trucks slamming through bodies like a demented war chariot. There was a split second where Twitch worried that he underestimated the weird boy's momentum and the xenos would just bowl through the cultists and keep chasing. But then he heard the horrible slop sound and a bellow of,
You get a squiggin', and you get a squiggin', and you get a squiggin'. Everybody gets a zoggin' squiggin'.
After that, Twitch declared the plan a success and began working on his way towards the Demon Throat crater. After a minute or so, he ran into Nubby, who complained that he was tired of dragging Fumbles and insisted Twitch take a turn. Fumbles groaned and asked whether he could be carried upright, as the floor was really beginning to chafe. The three of them arrived back at the crater just in time to see Doc get stabbed in the face.
Show starts in 8 minutes. Yum, yum. It's time for a tasty and refreshing snack.
What a zoggin' moment. What's this now?
It's called an intermission, boss.
Intermission? What?
Intermission. It means a break.
Well, I
We
don't
promise
like
to
it.
satisfy your
Boss,
hunger,
it's
your
part of
thirst,
your inner-
your sweet tooth. So visit our
your mind
refreshment center
picture
now.
thing, I
Let's
guess.
go.
What?
Show
It's
starts
in my
in
mind.
7 minutes.
Yeah, it's all in your mind.
Oh, Zogan. Alright, I'm gonna fix this real good like.
Up until Nubby and Twish's return, things have been pretty uneventful in the crater. Tink has started his work surveying the remains of the containment unit, and it had been hard to say exactly what the Inquisitor had been doing prior to this shit fanning, but since the bottom half of it was pretty much vaporized, Tink was willing to bet that it had ended with the demon thrope doing something to overload the batteries. Luckily, though, the top half was pretty much intact, and that was where Spot, the fancy Wraithbone suppressor, and the single mundane side suppressor had been mounted, so he got to work prying those free. While Dink worked, he tried to figure out what to do with the stuff once he pried it out. His original orders had been to go get the Wraithbone thingy and, I don't know, figure out how to turn it into a gun or something. But he wasn't exactly sure how to do that. In fact, he had no idea how the extra powerful suppressor worked, and he was pretty sure Fio didn't actually know either, despite the little Xeno being the one who created the thing. All Tink knew is that the Tau thingy made the Wraithbone thingy project some anti-psi thingy, and if you connect tendrils to the psi conducting material to the device, you could spread the anti-psi around a bit. Anyways, his original plan had been to pull out Spot, fix anything that was obviously wrong with it, and the Wraithbone suppressor, and then maybe make a net or something out of the tendrils. The problem was that the tendrils were completely gone, and even worse, the stupid Eldar had done something to stress the Wraithbone out like taffy. What had once been a cylinder block-sized brick was now a vaguely phallic-looking object which was about a meter long. And while Fio's device was still intact, it no longer fit properly. Lacking any real idea what to do, Tink decided to just go ahead with the pulling and the fixing and just hope that he'd spontaneously think of something clever. Tink still hadn't thought of anything by the time he finished prying everything loose, so he screwed around for a few minutes setting up the mundane size suppressor next to Doc so that the medic would stop bugging him about it. While he did this, the techie debated pulling out his plasma gun and telling the Eldar to return the Wraithbone to its original shape or die. Doc was against this idea for various reasons, and there was a brief argument which ended with Tink asking the highly inappropriate question of why the Xenos reshaped the Wraithbone into a giant stone dong. Doc impatiently told the techie that she was probably making a spear or something and suggested that he get back to work. Doc's response triggered something in Tink's imagination and the techie got thoughtful. Then he got even more thoughtful. Then he went over to his drone, lined up all the parts in a new orientation, and started snickering. And that's why, at the end of things, it turned out that our secret anti-demon rope weapon was Spot the Wonder Drone, with an amusingly shaped Wraithbone spear strapped to its undercarriage. You know, like a battering ram or a bayonet or, well, a lot of other non-phallic things. Anyways, Tank got to work strapping things onto and just bending the shit out of Fio's device until it fit a new shape. And the whole time this was going on, Doc continued watching the door and working on his patient. The medic's time at the bottom of the crater was even less interesting than Tink's, for the most part at least. The Eldar wasn't in great shape. Plasma and pulse rounds are pretty nasty when you're in full armor. Taking a barrage more or less naked is not good for oneself. Still though, they were sort of the wounds that Doc was really good at treating, and he did a fair job patching her up. Hell, he even cleaned up all the gore and debris off the area of the floor he was operating on. If that's not quality service, I don't know what is. Doc did good work. Half cauterized wounds were sprayed with sealant. The 2 bags of Inquisition torture, trademark, brand xenos blood substitute, non-fatal to over 60% of humanoid xenos scum. Extend your torture experience for weeks. were administered. A completely mangled arm was removed and tossed into a corner somewhere, and a bunch of other boring medical stuff was done. For the most part, the Eldar just lay there unconscious, but after a while, she started twitching and emitting a bit of a random psychic noise, which was distracting enough that Doc asked Tink to rig up the regular side suppressor nearby. That was as far as interruptions from his patients, but there were also 3 or 4 other occasions where Doc had to drop his bandage and pick up his weapon. Honestly, these interruptions were much more interesting than the medical procedures. Most of the time was a matter of something poking his head around the edge of the hole of the wall and then scampering away when Doc sprayed a bit of suppression fire in its direction. The only time when it didn't work was when a lucky shot took the head off of something that might have been a small Kroot hound, and when a heavily armored but armless servitor plodded through, Doc's fire that is, and seemed not to notice, looked around for a few seconds while he reloaded, and then just walked away again. So yeah, things were pretty dull for Doc, right up until his patient woke up, that is. You know how in stories the beautiful female patient wakes up and meets her doctor's eyes and then smiles and says something about how she must be dreaming? Yeah, that didn't happen. Doc looked up from the sound of approaching footsteps and set aside his scalpel in favor of his carbine, but then relaxed when he saw it was only Nubby and company. When he looked back down, the scalpel was in his patient's one remaining hand and was darting up towards his eye. Luckily, Doc is a combat medic, which meant that he typically treated guardsmen, armsmen, and other violent-prone individuals. And when that sort of person is hurt and confused, they tend to lash out. Over the course of his career, he'd had his arms broken, he's been jabbed in the thigh with a fistful of tranq ampules, received a small caliber bullet in the chest and helmet, and had been socked in the face for at least a dozen times. That sort of experience builds up some serious reflexes. So when the wounded Eldar tried to stab Doc in the eye with his own scalpel, the medic was flinching backward and raising his arms to block before he even registered what was happening. Of course, an unarmored arm can only do so much to stop a blade. The scalpel went right through Doc's forearm, between what he still referred to as the inside arm bone and outside arm bone, then continued upwards towards the meat of his face, and finally lodged into his cheekbone. Doc swore and reeled backwards with his arm pinned to his face, but that was still a lot better than getting stabbed in the eye. The Eldar followed her attack up with a grab for Doc's pulse carbine, but it was still strapped, and Doc's pinned arm was in the way. Doc swore again as the gun caught on his arm and twisted the scalpel in his face, and countered by punching the uncooperative xenos in the nose with his free hand. This was enough to knock her backwards, but she kept a grip on the gun, and as she fell, Doc swore a third time as he landed face and scalpel first onto the ground. At this point, the Eldar decided that a change of plan was called for. While Doc struggled to roll over and bring his gun to bear, she staggered to her feet, sighted on the side suppressor that had been set up nearby, and sprang towards it. She got within a meter before Nubby and Twitch shot her in the back. Nubby and Twitch kept their guns on the prone Eldar as they entered the small evidence room. Behind them, Bumbles was been unceremoniously dumped onto the ground as they grabbed their weapons, complained that his nose felt like it was broken. He was told to put his big boy pants on. At the other end of the room, Tink asked if they had everything under control, and then, without waiting for an answer, dropped his gun and went back to working on his drone. The two troopers advanced past Doc, who'd finally got back upright, but still had his arm pinned to his face, and stopped a few meters from the Eldar. By unspoken agreement, Twitch kept his weapon raised while Nubby moved forwards, hooked a metal toe under the groaning xenos, and flipped her over. The Eldar flopped upright and hacked and coughed and groaned. Nubby cheerfully told her it served her right for moving around so much after surgery. He went on to tell her that she was being very uncooperative, but if she promised to apologize, he was sure Doc would patch her up a second time. The Eldar spat blood at him and stated that she would rather die. Nubby and Twitch looked at each other and shrugged. Well, you're the lady. The Elder's eyes went wide as she got as far as, what? Before Twitch and Nubby opened fire. Over where he was working, Tink let out a surprised curse and began loudly complaining that there were bits of brain all over Spot's new external battery unit. Nubby just snickered, but Twitch yelled some rude things back at the techie and began loudly complaining that nobody was ever really grateful. When Doc told him to calm down, the Demolisher Trooper rounded on him and asked whether he was going to start whining about shooting his new xenos girlfriend. Doc pulled his arm forward off the scalpel with a squelching sound and gingerly poked at this surgical implement stuck halfway in his face. He then let out a pained sigh and pointed out that he already had a girlfriend and he wasn't inclined to feel too sorry for anyone who stabbed him in the sinus. Further discussion was called off on the account of the deafening sound of 24 AA guns opening fire above us, and the arrival of the Demonthrope at the top of the crater. The Demonthrope's arrival was accompanied by a painful wave of psychic pressure and a slight breakdown in the fabric of reality. Up at the top of the crater, the walls and ceilings nearest the Demonthrope sprouted a film of pinkish-green stuff that might have been a cross between flesh and fungus. Down at our level, the pureed remains of the Inquisitor's retinue began to bubble and reform into mutated forms of rippers and gods. It was abruptly and unanimously decided that it was time to abandon the room and retreat to the larger warehouse. Doc stopped poking at his face, and he and Nubby Twitch began firing on the forming demonoids in controlled bursts. Tink gathered up his drone and a few tools he needed, and then sprinted for the exit while the rest of us gave covering fire. Bumbles met him at the edge of the warehouse, helped him unload, and then began assisting the techie by providing tools he needed without being asked. Tink didn't actually notice him doing this, but it really was quite helpful. A few seconds after Tink had exited, the rest of us slowly fell back. As we moved, we spared a few glances towards the Demonthrope, and were incredibly relieved that it was actually staying put at the top of the crater. We guessed that it had just moved to get out of the way of the AA guns we heard, and was perfectly happy hovering there and shooting lightning bolts at whoever was pestering out on the surface. We wished whoever that was luck, finished our retreat to the warehouse, and set up a firing position around the hole between it and the crater. Once we were in position, it was just your typical desperate holdout against ravenous alien invaders. You know, the thing that practically defines life in the Guard. I wouldn't say it was a stroll through the park, but it really wasn't that hard, even with the Demonthrope pressing our minds and the way the dead demonoids kept reforming. Of course, things became slightly more difficult when Bumbles jogged over and said Tink needed all our last pistol power packs and at least 4 pulse carbine packs. Over that new workstation, Tink had put the finishing touches on Spot. After the arrival of the Demonthrope, he decided he didn't really need all the mounting brackets he'd been planning to install, and the weird readings from Fio's suppression device could probably just be ignored. All that was really left to do was rig a way to get enough power to the suppressor while still leaving enough to fly. But there was a shortage of heavy-duty batteries, so he had to rig up something a little bit more creative, hence the need for all the power packs. After a little bit of whining and arguing, Bumbles returned with the packs, leaving Doc, Nubby, and Twitch with only 5 remaining between them. Tink slotted them into place, hoped really hard that he'd done the power math conversion correctly, and hit the on button on his controller. First, the lights came on. Then the hovering unit engaged and the stealth field cycled. And finally there was a flicker of static all along the protruding Wraithbone's, prow. Tink held his breath, then let a high-pitched shout of victory as the oppressive force of the Demonthrope's mind vanished. Over at the hole, the rest of us were a little too busy conserving ammo and holding the bloody line to see what Tink was so excited. But we figured it out when Spot shot between us and cut a small swath through the approaching swarm with its mere presence. We cheered, as well as the drone did a short victory lap and pushed forward to watch as it rose towards the Demonthrope. Spot the Wonder Drone flashed upwards, sliced through the crackling green shield surrounding the Demonthrope, and slammed into the thing's underbelly. As Spot's Psi Suppressor penetrated the creature's hide, it let out a roar of unfathomable pain and fury. Its shields vanished, and the demonoid minions around us collapsed into goo. We all cheered again and watched. The inky black tendrils holding the Demonthrope aloft twisted, flickered, and then reappeared. We stood there, waited to see what would happen next, and then flinched when the Demonthrope let out a roar and fired a bolt of green lightning at someone on the surface. Nubby swore, Twitch groaned, Bumbles started whimpering, and Tink asked if anyone could see what had happened to Spot. Doc, remaining calm though, the medic looked at the rest of us, and then in his stuffy voice, because he still had the damn scample in his face, said, "So, unless someone has a better plan, I think we should shoot it until we're out of ammo, and then run away if that doesn't work." And none of us did, of course, so we all gathered together, opened fire, and hoped like hell that the Demonthrope didn't have much juice left in it. As we fired, we couldn't help but notice that only one person up on the surface was firing with us, and they weren't using a pulse weapon. Up on the surface, Sarge pulled the pin on the Astartes-sized crack grenade he'd borrowed, and hoped like hell it was going to end better than the last time he'd try something like this. The fight on the top of the facility had begun with the 3 Deathwatch Marines charging forwards in an attempt to blitz the Demonthrope. In the opinion of possibly former Interrogator Greg Sargent, this was a very stupid idea. It wasn't that blitzing the Xanthrope was a bad idea in and of itself. In fact, if you look it up in the Tacticia, they're defined as psychic artillery, and the preferred methods of dealing with them are generally the same as other varieties of artillery. Ideally, you just call it an airstrike, or some preferably longer-ranged artillery of your own. But if that's not an option, then you're going to want to get in close where the big guns can't easily get at you. Of course, the tricky part is not getting blown out of little pieces while you're trying to close the distance, but the Tacticia had some good recommendations there too. If you're a brave soldier of the Imperium, then you're supposed to just sprint across the killing fields, firing wildly and relying on your faith in the Emperor to protect you. If you're, on the other hand, you're a cowardly dog and not fit to wear the Emperor's uniform, then you'll want to make use of cover and snake around the flanks while those brave soldiers get themselves killed. So, given that the Space Marines are the very definition of brave soldiers of the Imperium, and were wearing enough power armor to survive that sort of foolishness, their choice of attack was tactically sound. Or it would have been if they were actually fighting a Xanthrope. Seriously, it wasn't some frail, slow-moving creature that relied on distance and minions to protect it from harm. It was a demon host. You know those things that could turn a frail little cultist into nigh indestructible killing machines capable of tearing tanks apart with its bare hands? What the Marines thought they were going to accomplish by getting closer to it was a mystery, especially since it currently was flying 15 meters over the top of a deep crater. Despite the temptation, Sergeant Amy didn't stand around critiquing the Marines' choice of tactics. This was partially because the situation was too serious to waste time being petty and unhelpful, but mostly they just figured the Demonthrope would handle it for them. The two of them slowly advanced behind the Marines, placing aim shots at the growing number of demonoid Tyranid hybrids pouring out of the hole in reality the Demonthrope was tearing, and waiting to see what was going to happen. Surprisingly, though, what happened was nothing. The 3 Astartes charged in. Well, the apothecary just jogged, spraying fire and fending off the odd demonoid, but the Demonthrope just manifested a greenish-black shield and ignored them while it poured more and more juice into widening the hole in reality. Between the shots, Sergeant Amy snickered to themselves as the Marines reached the edge of the crater and then milled around, trying to figure out how to respond to being dismissed as non-threats. Of course, the Death Watch Marines didn't waste too much time standing around. The trio of superhuman warriors drew upon their centuries of tactical knowledge and came to the conclusion that they should try shooting the psychic bug harder. As Guardsmen, Sarge and Amy wholeheartedly approved of this decision and concentrated on keeping the smaller bugs in check while the Space Marines poured a ludicrous number of bolt rounds into the shield. Seriously, when I say ludicrous, I mean it. All three Marines were firing their bolters on full auto. The Heart Marine was actually using his one-handed while firing a plasma pistol in the other. And they were reloading faster than seemed physically possible. How much ammo the Marines had, or where in Emperor's name they'd keeping it all, was a bit of a mystery. But Sarge and Amy both swore that the trio managed to put upwards to 200 rounds into the Demon Throat's shield before it popped. Now, this is where the Deathwatch Marines learned the real difference between the Xanthrope and the unholy creature we hauled across the galaxy. When their barrage broke down the Demon Throat's shield, it didn't fall over dead or try wriggling away. No. All the dozen of bolt rounds at the center mass managed to do was make the thing angry, and Demon Host can get very, very angry. The only reason the Astartes weren't vaporized was their superhuman speed and the fact that despite their initial choice of tactics, they did have a bit of self-preservation instincts. When the Demon's rope rounded on them, the three Marines scattered, barely avoiding the psychic tantrum that turned roughly 50 meters of facility roof into warp-tainted mixture of rubble and molten slag. Sarge and Amy watched the light show, noting the power of the attack and the way bits of dead demonoid rose into the air to fill the Demon Thrope's bolter wounds, and congratulated themselves on their decision to stick to shooting the little bugs. Eventually, though, the Demon Throat's tantrum ended, and the bugs turned back towards its now shrinking portal. It seemed to go pensive for a few seconds, and then with a flap of its wings, the bug entered the portal, into its oppressive psychic presence vanished. Sarge and Amy stayed in the cover waiting to see what horrible thing would happen next. But after a solid minute of nothing, they went back to picking off the demonoids. A few minutes later, the last of the bugs were dead. The Marines clawed their way out of the rubble at the edge of the destroyed area, and everyone was gathered around the shrinking warp portal as the hole finally disappeared with a little pop. Then Sarge sighed in relief, and then froze as Grumpy Marine said,
More power than I expected, but far less courage. That was almost too easy.
Amy got as far as, "You just had to fuck," before the nearby mountaintop exploded in green light. The green light was followed by the familiar psychic screeching and the appearance of a rift in reality large enough to peek over the top of the mountain. Sarge sighed and facepalmed, while Amy decided it was time to boost morale via friendly insults, specifically ones targeted at the Grumpy Marine, and whatever retarded chapter of retard spawned your retarded ass. The black and white Space Marine didn't seem to take these completely innocent comments very well, but before anything could come of it, both Sarge and Amy were yanked off their feet. The apothecary and Heart Marine tucked the two guardsmen under their arms like fussy children and began running up the mountain at a pace that could be described as terrifying. Sarge, possibly because he's far less of an asshole, was carried facing forwards, which meant that he was able to watch as the mountaintop grew a layer of flesh fungus and a tide of mutated gaunts poured over it. He briefly considered picking a few of the bugs off while the apothecary ran, but gave up after an especially large jump jammed his carbine scope halfway into his eye socket. Amy just swore at the Heart Marine and promised terrible vengeance for such an undignified treatment. The ride ended when the first of the demonoids came within range. Sarge was placed on a boulder with a good view of the bug-covered slope. Amy was just unceremoniously dumped on the ground, and the three Deathwatch Marines began advancing towards the glowing mountaintop. Once again, it was a matter of Sarge and Amy providing covering fire while keeping their heads down. But this time, the rough terrain and large number of hostiles meant the Astartes' attack was more of a slog than a blitz. Not that the lack of speed made it any less impressive. These are the Emperor's Angels of Death we're talking about. All three of the Deathwatch Marines collected more kills than Sarge while simultaneously dealing with the enemy's attacks and climbing a bloody mountain. If it weren't for the fact that Amy's sniping skills, not to mention her techno-heretical armament, managed to keep her in the lead on points, Sarge might have had to admit that honest guardsmen couldn't compete with genetically engineered super soldiers. Anyways, the advance to the top of the mountain went off with only 2 or 3 sketchy moments. The worst of which was when Grumpy Marine let himself get flanked by a bunch of mutated gaunts for some reason. I mean, he just stood there like an idiot, pawing at his belt. It was like he forgot how many grenades he had or something. Amy had pulled off an absolutely amazing barrage of double kills to keep his stupid ass bug-free. Aside from that, the time when one of the larger demonoids almost managed to sneak up on Amy before Sarge noticed it, and the incident with the looser-than-expected boulder. The advance to the mountaintop went smoothly. Of course, you know what Murphy says about attacks that go really well. Okay, well, technically what happened wasn't an ambush, so maybe the old adage isn't perfect, but the end result was about the same. The top of the mountain was a smallish plateau with a bunch of sciencey antennas on it, plus a glowing rift in reality and an irritable demon throat. The 3 Deathwatch Marines advanced right up to the edge, cleared out the last of the gaunts, and then all 3 prepped some crack grenades and vaulted over the lip of the plateau. Neither Sarge or Amy could see what happened next, but at least one of the grenades must have struck its target because the demon throat let out a mind-rending screech of pain. Unfortunately, it also let out a blinding blast of green energy which shook the entire mountain, guardsmen included, like an abusive nanny. Sarge wound up lying on his back, blinking and trying to remember what he'd been doing, and then flinched as something large flew a few meters over his head. He reflectively turned to watch as the object sailed a few dozen more meters, clipped a boulder, cartwheeled into a short arc, landed with a crunching sound, and finally skidded to a halt. Sarge blinked again and idly wondered why the unidentified crashing object looked so familiar. Then his dazed brain kicked back into gear, put 2 and 2 together, got 5, decided it was close enough, and signaled his mouth. Holy shit, it's raining Space Marines! Amy, who had even been more out of it than Sarge, moaned and crawled into cover underneath a nearby boulder. Not because she understood a single word Sarge was saying, but because taking cover was the guard-issue response to confusion and incoherent orders. She huddled there for a few seconds, clutched her head, and wondered why she'd ever left her regiment, and then registered what Sarge had said at about the same time that the dazed non-com realized himself. Both of them jumped to their feet, ran downhill towards the crumpled form of the Marine formerly known as Grumpy. Well, actually, the former was premature. When Sarge reached the battered Marine, he was still breathing and in possession of over 3/4 of his appendages. It was hard to say whether the missing foot was due to the blast, the fall, or a pack of demonic rippers that started gnawing on the Astartes while Sarge was staggering around, but it's not likely that it really matters. After some initial clearing, Amy began picking off all nearby bugs, while Sarge propped the wounded Marine up against a covering-provided rock and tried to decide what to do next. His thought process was interrupted when the rock exploded. For the second time in 5 minutes, Sarge found himself on his ass, wondering what the hell was going on. This time, though, the sight of the demon throat drifting down the mountainside shook him out of it. He staggered outright and analyzed his current situation with the speed of the truly desperate. It was a complex tactical situation. Sarge was bleeding, slightly burned, and had at least 1 broken rib. The Space Marine was unconscious and was now slightly less than 3/4 intact. Both of them had been flung a few meters down the serene slope and were now on top of a 20-ish meter cliff. Friendlies-wise, Amy wasn't anywhere to be seen. Neither were the other 2 Deathwatch Marines. As for hostiles, all the little bugs were dead, and the demon throat appeared to be focused on the wounded Marine, and was gathering greenish-black electricity for another attack. Finally, the only option for cover was a smallish pile of rocks a few meters away, which was way too far to drag a ton of power-armored Space Marine. It was a tricky situation. In fact, it was the sort of tactical problem that a tribunal of senior Inquisitors might spend an entire day and a half arguing over. Sarge didn't have that sort of time, though. He responded to the complex tactical situation by pushing the Space Marine off the cliff. Now, despite the apparent retardation of this plan, it worked. The Space Marine flopped over the edge a bare second before the Demon Throat's attack hit. Instead of being blown into pieces by a bolt of green lightning, the wounded Space Marine merely suffered a bone-shattering fall and downhill tumble. This was unquestionably a win. Unfortunately, Sarge wasn't in much condition to appreciate it because it'd taken him just a bit too long to shove the Heavy Marine over the edge. The blast caught Sarge in the back as he scrambled for cover, inflicting a few more shrapnel wounds and superficial burns in addition to knocking him prone. He struggled back to his feet as the Demon Throat screeched in rage as he was deprived of his original target, turned its metal-covered face towards Sarge instead. The dazed non-com attempted to stagger the rest of the way into cover. Realized he'd never make it, he raised his carbine instead. He got off only 3 shots before the Demon Throat's eyes flared. An invisible force ripped the gun out of Sarge's hands, and then began inexorably pressing in on him on all directions. It was at this point Amy decided that it was time to stop sitting around waiting for the Marines to show up and do something heroic. Over the last minute or two, she'd picked herself up from where she'd been thrown, found a nice firing position, and watched the Demon Throat attack in a desperate attempt to discover some sort of weakness. Unfortunately, it seemed to lack any giant glowing weak points, and while it had initially sported some nasty-looking wounds in the front, the remains of several demonoids had risen up and filled in the holes in a thoroughly disgusting fashion. So, lacking ideas of how to kill a continuously regenerating creature that shrugged off bolt rounds and grenades, she settled for shooting in the eye and hoping it was easily distracted. The Demon Throat screeched and released Sarge as the pulse round punched through the metal plate welded to its face and put out its left eye. It then turned towards Amy, and then caught a shot in the other eye. As Amy had suspected, neither shot did much to incapacitate the creature, but it sure as hell pissed it off. The rock that the Markswoman was firing from exploded in a shower of semi-molten shrapnel, but at that point, she'd already rebased. Amy popped up from her new position, landed yet another headshot, and then scrambled backwards over a ridge of scree, where she paused for a second before picking out another good-looking rock. She scrambled downhill, keeping the small ridge between her and the enemy until she reached the rock, where she readied her rifle for another shot. It was then, as Amy rose up for her third attack, that she realized that it had been really stupid to assume the Demon Throat would just keep hovering around a few meters above the ground level while it chased her. Amy peeked out of cover for the Demon Throat, a mere 30 meters above in front of her, and in the corona of green electricity already gathering around it. The markswoman reflectively flinched downwards, and it was already too late. There was a flash of green light, a blast of heat, and then nothing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence and darkness, there came a horrible, horrible familiar pain. A couple 100 meters away, Sarge paused for his search for his dropped carbine and listened in confusion to what sounded like the bellowing of a stuck rocks. Then, after a few seconds of incoherent screaming, transitioned into a wail of, "Why is it always my fucking face?" Sarge gave up the search for his weapon, drew his last pistol, and started sprinting. Fortunately, Sarge didn't get a chance to try attacking the demonically possessed Tyranid Psyker with nothing but his last pistol and his guard-issued adamantium balls. I mean, I'm totally sure it would have worked out, but the sheer awesomeness of this inevitable victory probably would have caused the universe to implode or something. So, all in all, it was a very good thing that he only got 3 steps before the Deathwatch Marines finally returned from whatever tea party they were having. Bolt of fire erupted from somewhere lower on the mountain, and while it wasn't perfectly aimed as Amy's shot had been, it was still enough to convince the big bug that it had better things to do than finish off a slightly overcooked guardswoman. Not having anything to prove to anybody, Sarge hunkered down behind a rock until the demonthrope had finished screeching in rage and launched itself towards the source of the fire, and then followed the source of incoherent cursing, and also the smell of burnt hair, to his markswoman. It turned out that Sarge was actually the second person to reach Amy. He arrived to find the apothecary crouched over the still smoldering markswoman, spraying her with what could have been either synth skin or fire suppressant. Whatever it was, though, judging by the way Amy was squirming and swearing even louder, it stung like a son of a bitch. Anyways, as Sarge arrived, the apothecary tucked Amy under his arm. Sarge thought he remembered the Marine having 2 of those earlier, but wasn't quite sure, and turned to face him. The Marine started to bellow some sort of order, then paused and gave Sarge a look that managed to convey, "Are you retarded?" despite being delivered through a helmet.
Where's your weapon, Guardsmen?
Sarge blinked, tried to think of a diplomatic response, and then decided he was too sore and tired for this shit. "Dunno. Where's your arm, Marine?" After a very awkward silence, the apothecary sighed and began explaining the tactical situation. In short, Jim had calmed the Marines, ours were still jammed, and informed them that the A-guns would be coming online soon. The Heart Marine was distracting the demon's throat and drawing it into a good firing position for all the guns to hit it, while the apothecary was trying to get him some reinforcements. Unfortunately, the apothecary had been disarmed and running on stims. Grumpy Marine's diagnostics cogitator was reporting massive trauma and something like 50 broken bones, and Amy had been temporarily blinded. So Sarge was all there was, and he'd lost his bloody gun. Anyways, there was a bit of yelling, a bit of negotiation, a futile search for whatever Amy had dropped her weapon, and just maybe a small amount of theft. In the end, Sarge left Amy and the incredibly battered Grumpy Marine to the apothecary, and ran down the mountainside armed with a far too large bolter and an oversized crack grenade. As Sarge quickly descended back down to the facility and desperately tried to avoid face planting as he did so, the Heart Marine was playing hide and shoot with the increasingly frustrated demonthrope. Sarge couldn't see much of the Marine, who was wildly dodging through the rooftop structures, but it was impossible to miss the lightning blast, large-scale psychokinesis tantrums, and the more occasional demonic attack that he was dodging. All in all, it looked like an absolutely suicidal fight to get involved in, especially given how poorly Sarge's own attempt to do that sort of thing had gone. His back was absolutely killing him. Still though, Sarge had to do something to help. So, when he finally reached the facility rooftop, he propped the oversized bolter on a chest-high pipe like it was a heavy stubber. Sarge planned out his escape path, took careful aim, fired, and completely missed by like 30 meters. It was pathetic. In what would have been the most humiliating experience in his life if anyone had been around to see it, Sarge proceeded to miss 2 more carefully aimed shots before giving up. He then switched the bolter over to automatic and attempted to lay down some orc-style suppressive fire. The gun, which had doubtlessly been forged by some master artisan and performed flawlessly in centuries of combat, jammed on the second shot. Swearing like only a non-com can, Sarge picked up the jammed bolter and threw it at the demonthrope. The heavy gun sailed a good 10 meters below the demonthrope, and then bounced off a pipe and over the edge of the roof. When asked what happened to the bolter afterwards, Sarge told the apothecary that the demonthrope had used his telekinetic powers to snatch it from his grip. He didn't become aware that the rooftop vid recorders had caught the whole shameful show, including the gleeful lie, until far, far later. After spending a second cursing the stupidity of what he had just done, Sarge drew his last pistol and finally scored a hit on the Demonthrope. Unfortunately, last pistols aren't known for their ability to pierce demonically reinforced chitin, and the creature just ignored the pitiful attack and continued trying to kill the Heart Marine. Sarge swore some more, trying to draw a bead on one of the warp fire-filled eye holes that Amy had punched into the Demonthrope faceplate, and then nearly had a heart attack as 24 anti-air guns opened fire from every direction. Sadly, the Halo Flak didn't immediately reduce the Demonthrope into an airborne pile of demonically tainted chunky salsa. The creature took several hits, enough to kill anything that could really be called alive in the first place. But before it was overwhelmed, it managed to furl its wings into a sort of shield and drop into the mouth of the crater it had originally exited the facility from. It didn't drop all the way down the crater, though. Once out of the AA turret's line of sight, it spread its wings again and began regenerating its wounds. Sarge swore that the creature's refusal to just die already, but noticed that it was a lot more trouble healing itself than it had previously. He wasn't sure whether it was the lack of nearby demonoids to cannibalize, the corpses had dissipated after the warp had closed, or if it was the creature was finally running out of juice. But either way, its regeneration was going slower. Unfortunately, it appeared to be countering for its difficulty by getting even more demony. Some of the wounds were filling with eyeballs and tentacles instead of chitin, and the local area was getting awfully warpy. As Sarge moved closer to the crater, in the vague hope that the shorter range would let him use his last pistol or grenade effectively, he crossed through patches of rapidly growing mutated plants, chittering whispers, frost, and other lesser phenomena. Of course, compared to the stuff that he'd seen during the warp voyage with the Demonthrope, these phenomena were positively mundane. He soldiered through them without any problems more significant than one of the little bitey bugs that the Demonthrope loved so much, and getting his pathway up his pants before getting it squished. Still, though, it slowed him down a bit, which meant that only the Heart Marine was there to keep pressure on the bug while he healed up. Luckily, the Marine was a big boy who could handle himself, only suffering a few non-fatal injuries during his wait. So Sarge finally pushed through the last phenomena, a patch of snow and ice that was actually quite refreshing compared to the local scorching temperature. At about the point when Tink finished booting up Spot, he watched with the same sense of triumph, then disappointment, that the rest of us felt when the Wraithbone armed drone impaled the Demonthrope and the thing still didn't die. Just like the rest of us, he and the Heart Marine decided that the only thing to do was to keep attacking and hope that Spot was weakening the bug enough for regular weapons to finish the job. Sarge put his last pistol away, spent a good few seconds gauging the distance to the Demonthrope and the weight of the Astartes-sized crack grenade, and then threw the explosive at the back while it launched one of its green lightning bolts. The grenade flew in a perfect arc, hit the Demonthrope right between the base of its wings, failed to adhere properly, and dropped off. Fortunately, especially for those standing under the Demonthrope and the grenade, Sarge had let the crack cook a little. It exploded just half a meter under the creature, and pretty much the entire lower quarter of the thing, plus a good chunk of its back, was instantly removed. It writhed in the air, spraying ichor and screeching, and for a second we all thought that between the blast and the small arms fire, we'd finally done it. Then we noticed the damage to Spot. Down in the facility, Tink swore as Spot reported severe damage to its hover unit. He desperately tried to use the drone's little manipulator arm to grab at something, but wasn't fast enough. The drone sank away from where it had been pressed into the Demonthrope's underbelly, until it was hanging by the, spearhead at the end of the Wraithbone's size suppressor. Sarge watched in alarm as the Demonthrope's wing flared larger, Lacking any more useful ideas, he began firing his las pistol as fast as possible while screaming at the Heart Marine on the opposite side of the crater to kill the thing before the drone fell off. The Astartes responded to these unhelpful instructions by pausing for a second and then lowering his bolter. Seeing this, Sarge began to scream something impolite, but paused himself as the Space Marine suddenly exploded into a full sprint towards the Demonthrope. The yellow-shouldered Death Watch Marine charged forward, simply ignoring a lightning blast that ripped a large chunk out of his side. He reached the edge of the crater where, with an echoing shout of,
"We die in glory!"
he jumped and hit the Demonthrope with a literal flying tackle. Then, with one arm and both legs wrapped around the creature, he reached down, ripped Spot loose, and then slammed the Tau drone spike first into the Demonthrope's metal-covered face repeatedly. God damn, that's metal. Now that was a sight that gave us pause. I mean, who wakes up in the morning expecting to see a Space Marine beat a demon-possessed Tyranid Psyker over the head with a Tau drone and a Wraithbone Myrtleade? Seriously, it was the single weirdest thing we'd ever seen, and believe you me, that is really saying something. All of us stopped firing and just watched the Death Watch Marine went at it like a giant hate-fueled anthropomorphic jackhammer, each blow resulting in a pained screech and a flickering of the Demonthrope's wings, which dropped both it and the Space Marine increasingly large distances. The Heart Marine didn't let a little thing like gravity deter him, though. He just kept attacking until finally, when they were both about 60 meters off the ground, an especially violent blow left Spot well and truly stuck, and the Demonthrope's wings shrank to little black pinpricks. We scrambled back to the pair, them slamming into the ground, with the Space Marine on the bottom, with a giant enough force to leave a powered armored-shaped dent in the floor. Then, after waiting a second to see if anything else would happen, Doc ran forwards to check on the Space Marine, while Tink ran forward to check on Spot. The prognosis was grim on both cases. Doc was pretty sure that the internal organs weren't supposed to be squeezing out through a wound in one side, and Spot's jury-rigged battery unit burst into flames when Tink touched it. Even worse, when the battery caught fire, the Demonthrope's wings flared about the size of chickens, and the gore that filled the room began flowing towards it. Tink started running around trying to rig up a new power source, while the rest of us began screaming at each other of whether or not we should try to kick, stab, or las pistol the Demonthrope to death. Everyone but Tink was out of ammo, before it regenerated and killed us all. We were so wrapped up in this that it wasn't until Fumbles mentally poked at us that we noticed the two servitors and a slightly oversized server's skull that had entered the room. As soon as we turned around and Twitch had been stopped from snap shooting anything, the big server's skull began transmitting a rather nasal voice. It welcomed us to the lab, informed us that we were over 2 months late delivering the Xanthrope, and asked if we'd seen the Inquisitor's rosette anywhere, as he needed it for opening the rest of the stasis units. And Doc, who still had a scalpel on his face, seized on the words Xanthrope, my lab, and stasis, and interrupted the skull. The medic, speaking quickly and rather incoherently, informed whoever was controlling the skull that if he wanted their damn Xanthrope, we needed a psi suppressor equipped with stasis unit, whatever parts Tinks asked for, and another stasis unit to hold the Heart Marine until we found the apothecary. Now, the skull rocked backwards, probably imitating the owner's shocked expression, and began to respond before Doc cut it off with the shouts, "Now, now, 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 now!" This was enough to convince who owned the facility that we were serious. The servo skull still silent and then zipped away. Less than a minute later, one of those present cell cubes was carried through the hole by the giant man-beast that we'd seen in the middle of the fight. It was followed by some servitors carrying other cubes and a wide selection of parts. With the help of the servitors and the giant, seriously, up close, this thing looked like a man-shaped biotitan, The demon throat was secured before its wings got more than a meter long. The wraith bone was hooked up to the cell's power supply, and since it was thoroughly embedded in spot, the whole battered drone was taped to the ceiling just above the cell's stasis field. The heart marine and all the organs Doc could find nearby, some probably weren't his, was put into stasis in time as well, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Then the servo skull noticed the dead Eldar and started screaming at us, which pretty much set the tone for the next 2 days. Well, that's actually getting a little ahead of things. At the time, we just put up with the rantings of the skull's owner, a man identifying himself as Magos Smith, and the overseer of the facility, because he was the leader of a group of servitors and prisoners that had won the big melee in the warehouse. Having your own army, including a man-beast capable of flipping tanks one-handed, means you're outspoken and eccentric, as opposed to annoying and crazy. Anyways, the Magos got tired of yelling at us about the same time Doc finished patching the rest of us up and finally got around to removing the scalpel from his face. The tech priest announced that he needed to organize the packing and would meet us on the surface. And then the oversized servo skull zipped off as a servitor equipped with an anti-grav pallet drifted into the room. We rode up to the top of the crater in style. A cargo pallet stitched to the augmented husk of a lobotomized criminal is stylish, right? And we met up with Sarge at the lip. At about the same moment as we disembarked, Jim and the adepts began climbing through the door to the elevator shaft. Jim was the first through the hole. He acquired a dozen servo skulls during his adventures, as well as a few holes that were leaking blood and lubricant. Sarge winced and vowed to avoid Hana for the next few weeks. Next came the cogitator adept, who looked like he licked an electrical outlet. And then the xenologist adept, or to be more precise, his corpse, was lifted through. Finally, the diplomat adept was completely fine, climbed out. Doc immediately ran over to give aid, while Sarge surveyed the ragged group for a few seconds, and then asked what had happened. Jim shrugged and said, "Turret," and the cogitator adept mumbled something about feedback. Then the diplomacy adept cheerfully announced that he'd shot the xenologist on the account of him being a traitor. Before Sarge could get his mind around what he just heard, Twitch announced that he'd known the dead adept was a traitor all along, and asked if he'd been working for the demonoids or the orcs. The old adept told him it was the orcs, suggested he go find out what data the deceased might have passed off to the vile xenos, and then patiently waited for Sarge to ask something less retarded. After a painfully long wait, Sarge said he'd never seen the xenologist adept do anything traitory. The diplomat pointed out that waiting to kill a traitor until after they've betrayed you would be horribly sloppy. Sarge nodded at this sage advice and asked how the diplomat had known the adept was a traitor, and immediately regretted the decision as the man launched into a long and detailed explanation. About halfway through, Tink got bored and asked if the diplomat was secretly an Inquisitor or something. This remark caused the old adept to give up on his explanation with a pained sigh. He spent a few seconds thinking and then declared that he was not an Inquisitor. It was just far too athletic of a profession for him. He was just a simple adept who'd been part of Oak's retinue since the man was an interrogator. Of course, he said, this meant that he'd been in the Inquisition since before our great-great-great-grandfathers had been born, and despite it not being in the Administratum, seniority still counts for something. Essentially, he was Oak's trusted observer and knew how to inquisit better than all of us put together, so we should just shut up and trust him. Sarge announced that he was too tired to argue and would worry about it later. Tink and Nubby and even Twitch, who was flowcharting the Orc conspiracy, all agreed. Doc asked if all that meant the adept was supposed to be keeping us out of trouble, because if so, he was doing a terrible job of it. The diplomat said he was actually pretty happy with our performance, which was pretty disturbing when we thought about it. Further discussion on the subject of adepts was called off by the arrival of the apothecary and his patients. The grumpy marine was looking especially ragged. In addition to missing a foot and forearm, he had enough broken bones and internal injuries to keep even a space marine on the bench for a few months. Also, the apothecary said something about him having spinal damage due to a 30-meter fall directly onto his back. Sarge winced, but otherwise maintained his poker face. Amy was in slightly better shape. She was conscious, moderately lucid, she was swearing pretty creatively, could even see again, and was moving under her own power despite the number of shrapnel wounds and minor burns. Her head, though, was a mass of sprayed-on synth skin with eye holes cut into it. Doc was pretty sure that a lot of the synth skin was extraneous, though, and wagered that it was only the skin from her eyebrows up that was going to need replaced. Anyways, there was a fair bit of wincing when we saw Amy, and Tink Ever the Charmer pointed out that she really sucked at ducking. Twitch countered that she was actually pretty good at it, but she had also had some sort of power that attracted energy attacks to the face. Nubby cheerfully pointed out that at least she wouldn't have that skunk stripe, on the account of how all her hair would have to be regrown by the hospitaller this time. Amy reacted to these comments in the usual way. While the three assholes tried to avoid getting murdered by an enraged markswoman, and Bumbles ran around trying to calm everyone down, Doc and Sarge brought the two Marines up to speed on how the Demon Throat fight had ended and the status of the Heart Marine. Bringing the apothecary and his nearly comatose battle brother up to speed took a while, mostly because they kept asking for annoying little details and the diplomat kept showing them a data slate full of files that he'd gotten from somewhere. Then things were delayed even further when the elevator was pried open and a giant man thing that had a tech priest we assumed was the Magos, based on how he had a big service skull perched on his shoulder, stepped out. As the Magos and his entourage came over, we all reacted in the usual semi-paranoid way, but Jim took a step further and stretched out his mecha-andrites out towards the tech priest and his skull. This elicited a screeching burst of feedback which made us all flinch, and then the Magos skull sped over until it was right in front of Jim's face and screeched,
"Try that again, boy, and I will melt your pathetic organs you call a brain out your ears and repurpose your shell as a janitorial servitor."
The engine seer went as pale as he could, turned around and ran off to go check on the shuttle. His flock of servo skulls sped towards the Magos and then disappeared into the facility. There was an awkward moment after the skulls departed where we all stared at the Magos, waiting for him to continue yelling or whatever. The diplomacy adept found this hilarious for some reason, and after a few seconds told us not to worry about it and went back to talking with the apothecary about files, records, political cabals, and other such stuff we had no interest in. This continued a while, during which most of us wandered off to find some shade, water, smokes, etc. Sarge stayed put, though, and after a few minutes he signaled the rest of us to return. We listened to the apothecary announce that he suspected the Inquisitor hadn't been following proper disposal and investigative procedures, but the date we provided proved it. He was certain that the small room at the bottom of the crater was some sort of private cache, where especially valuable artifacts and samples were being stored for use by the Inquisitor. This was a grievous breach of responsibility, bordering on heretical even, given the nature of the evidence being stolen. The apothecary said he now believes that the mission had always been more about theft than investigation, which was probably why the Inquisitor had been so unhappy when the Death Watch team had been assigned to assist him. The diplomat smiled at this and, as if prodding a promising pupil, asked the Space Marine what he was going to do next. The apothecary thought for a few seconds and then declared that his assignment had been to assist the Inquisitor in his investigation, not to perform on his behalf after he'd gotten himself killed. This was set off some sort of objection from the half-comatose grumpy Marine, but he was pretty incoherent, and the apothecary just dranked him and continued. To sum up what was, in our humble opinion, a bunch of overly dramatic barracks lawyering, the Death Watch Marines decided, with the occasional suggestion from the diplomacy adept, that they were going to just pack up their shit and go home. They would take command of the Inquisitor's ship when it got back from futilely trying to send apothecary messages, and any of his surviving retinue, and haul it back to some Death Watch fortress or other, where their superiors could sort things out. So basically, yeah, you guys are probably in the right here, but we don't want to get involved. We're gonna creatively interpret our orders and just leave you here with your questionably legal research facility, conspiracies and counter-conspiracies, and assorted other bullshit. We'll send a new investigation over to arrest you in a few weeks. Try not to accidentally pack up all your shit and leave before they arrive. It was a very screw the brass response, and in that moment we felt a very deep sense of camaraderie with the Marines. We didn't say anything though, because the most reasonable Space Marine would probably take offense to being congratulated on how guard their decision-making had been. Anyways, the Death Watch wasn't going to stick around and fight with us, and as an added bonus, the apothecary said he was going to take Gravis off our hands. The Death Watch would handle the rest of his treatment and get both him and the Emperor's size that we left stranded back to their chapter. Doc and Sarge both practically collapsed in relief. And so did Nubby when the Marines just accepted the list of war gear lost due to enemy action. Once again, the Marines had wandered off. The diplomacy adept breathed a sigh of relief and announced that it was probably time for us to know what was really going on. There was an unanimous sarcastic response about how that would be nice for a change, which the old man ignored as he explained that he could only give us the basic story. Apparently, the question of whether to burden us with the details was something best left to the Inquisitor that Oak was assigning to us for the next mission. We all took note of that part, but kept quiet since the adept was finally telling us stuff we needed to know. The adept started talking about all sorts of political stuff, with factions and conspiracies and schools of thoughts and other shit, and then paused when Teak asked whether Thoranism meant that the Inquisitor was really fond of thunderhammers. The diplomat dialed the level of detail down a little bit, and then tried again. After 3 more attempts, all of which ended with spectacular confusion, the old adept took a seat on a pipe and restarted one last time.
Sit a while and listen. Look, ever since Oak first became Inquisitor, he's been struggling against the enemy inside the Inquisition. We don't know, or at least I don't, know exactly who these people are. But we call them and their minions the Sus Naevum Conspiracy, after the name of the school they tried to build. No, not Sus 9 Vroom, it's High Gothic. Please stop trying to call them the Conspiracy. Okay, this isn't obviously getting through to you. Let's try this again with visual aids. You see this sucker that I'm drawing an eye on? Hi, I am a shadowy group of Inquisitors who have fallen under the influence of chaos. You can call me the Conspiracy. Hello, I am Inquisitor Quercus, but you can call me Oak. Ha 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 ha. We're going to use inquisitional resources to create a successor of the Containment, which is an evil super-heretical school of bad ideas. An evil inquisitorial school, you say? I'm going to stop you. Then take your plan and use it to make a good inquisitional school. Take that. Curses. You and your retinue of brave, intelligent, and handsome individuals have foiled our evil plot. We will get you for this, Oak, and take the school back for ourselves. Not if I get to you first. Take that again. Ha! That was only one of our useless minions. We're far too evil and sneaky for you to ever catch us for real. No one is too evil and sneaky for me to catch. I'll track you down even if it takes me 300 years. At this point, Nubby interrupted and asked if Oak was really 300. And if that was the case, why did he look so young and normal while the adept looked like an old raisin man? The adept put the sock puppets down and sighed, and said that Magos Smith helped him with that. Before anyone else could ask pedantic questions, the servo skull returned and both the Magos and his giant man-beast started moving again. They both strolled over the elevator and retrieved a mobile stasis unit that matched one we've seen in the cell we've crammed the Deemthrope into. As he brought it over towards us, the diplomacy adept announced that we could get the rest of our information from Inquisitor Scifi. There was a brief period of confusion until the adept explained that Scifi had been Oak's liaison to the Magos, not the Inquisitor who had been compressed into a ball of gore. Anyways, the adept claimed that Oak had sent a message to the base saying we should assign this Inquisitor after our delivery. Sarge looked over the orders and acknowledged that they looked pretty official, but didn't actually have any clue if they were real or not. The stasis unit deactivated, and the Inquisitor slowly sat up. He scanned the area, and then his eyes came to rest on Sarge. Realization hit them both at the same time. Oh, not you again. Amy, Tink, the Adepts, and the Magos all watched in confusion as the rest of us alternatively groaned, swore, and cursed ourselves for not remembering that Scifi had been the name of the second interrogator we'd been assigned to.
We's gonna get an alcohol leave, no fights, we's gonna get a fucking end this red fight. With balls and fights, president spice, it's time to start a war all over the place. We will rock you. We will rock you. Go get some squiggers and the spouty bit before I go smashing your stupid face. You got mechas and space, the bosses and Jace. Gonna go smashing some movies today. We will rock you. We will rock you.